Hi, everybody. So today I just wanted to take some time. I've shared these MAP Spring administration reflections with upper management, but also wanted to make sure that stakeholders, the primary users of this information, the administrators of the test, also have these reflections, things that I've noticed. You, of course, I'm sure have your own reflections on your own campus, but these are things that are true or data that's been collected of the administration, the organization as a whole. So let's dive in. So today I'm going to talk about a couple things. We're going to start with the big picture goals that we're trying to accomplish, just as a reminder, information from the data in the survey, some reflections, and then sort of where we're headed next into the future. So let's start off with this question of what is MAP for? And the two main things that in the education team we want to make sure MAP is being used for is that MAP is being used to drive instructional decisions for teachers. That they are taking that information that kids have and putting it into their classrooms, using for it to prepare for the first week so they're not blindsided, so they're not stumbling through trying to figure out what the kid knows and doesn't know. MAP is supposed to give them that information. And then the other thing we want MAP to be used for is to help us in our enrollment decisions. If we're having difficult conversations with parents about, maybe taking things at the essentials level, we can use MAP to help support those reasonings and those kinds of transitions for classes with a more data-driven decision rather than kind of what it feels like. The challenge, of course, is that we need MAP data then before classes are actually started, right? Like if those are our two goals, we want teachers to bring this into their classroom and we want to make the right enrollment decisions. That means that we need this information before classes start. And historically, we have just kind of said, oh yeah, you need it to test, and different campuses have told me different answers in terms of what answers they've gotten in the past. But the goal really is to get this information prior to kids being in classes. And I think that this has sort of in the past generated a sort of chicken and egg problem. People don't end up using the data because we haven't really collected the data at really the right times. And so that was, my push in this spring is really putting on like, hey, we as the administrators of the test really just need to make sure that the data is there so that it's accessible and we can create this buy-in so that we can generate a positive feedback loop. That MAP is part of our conversations on campuses now. Now that it's part of the conversations on campuses, parents actually want to know what the scores are. So instead of us pulling their teeth to try to get them to come do the testing, they're like, wait, when is my kid's next MAP test? Which is a culture that they have on a lot of schools. That being said, I don't want to set these goals about testing aimlessly. We want to make sure that we're acknowledging that some kids, they do have really deep testing anxiety. They do have just a crippling school refusal issue that just means that going through a process like this is going to cause more harm than good. And that's the reason why we have a completion target of 80%, right? We're not expecting every single kid to come through and be able to tackle this test. And so, as such, 4 out of 5 kids is the goal that we're basically setting here. And in terms of exemptions, we haven't laid out a lot of really rigid groundwork around what that looks like. But so far, actually, I'm really comfortable with the amount of exemptions that we have had at Fusion. We actually, across the organization as a whole, had 8% of our kids exempted from the test. I think that's extremely reasonable. I, as a gut check, would have said 10% before I saw this number. And then I pulled it and I was very pleased. I do think that I'll come out probably with some more specific guidelines around exemptions in the future. Those of you who have asked know that there is already a kind of sample waiver available, but it might look a little bit different in the future. That's definitely something that is going to be being thought of. All right, so that's the idea. That's what we want out of MAP. That's our goal here in getting this information together. So let's take some time and actually dive into the data, the information that we did get from our spring testing this year. And to me, the most important number is this first one here. 63% of our tests for registered rostered kids were completed. So remember I said the target was 80%, so we're not quite there, but we are doing really nicely in our step towards going there. I wanted to compare this to previous years of testing. And obviously it didn't make a lot of sense to compare it to any COVID time period. So I compared to our spring 2019 testing time, and we did more than triple the number of tests in spring of 2021 than we did in spring of 2019. A couple of you might be there saying, well, okay, but mostly we used to be testing in the fall. And so in fall of 2019, if you remove language usage, since we're only talking about 2 of the 3 tests, we ran 2,700 tests, and this year we did 2,500 tests. But you'll remember we only did re-enrolling kids this year, and roughly our re-enrollment percentages across the organization are about 66%. So if you compare those pretty similar numbers of 2,500 tests this spring to 2,700 tests in fall of 2019, and then you compare that only re-enrolling kids number, you're actually seeing that we did a lot more tests this past spring than we ever have in the past, which means that we're taking a giant step in the right direction, which I think is really, really great news. Another thing that I wanted to look at is the difference between campuses that joined the online cohort versus campuses that chose to test for themselves. And we see that actually the online cohort had a lower completion rate at 54%, whereas on campus, just campus-owned completion was at 70%. I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but let me just leave it as just the numbers for now. The other thing that's interesting is despite the lower completion rates of the online cohort, most participants in the online cohort had very positive things to say about it. 24 of them said that they felt that the online cohort made testing easier versus 4 that said that it made it harder in some fashion. There were a couple of people who were neutral along the way. That's 3 of them. In general, also across both cohorts, online or campus-based, the majority of people thought that the communications and expectations were clear or clearer than usual this year. I didn't put an option for neutral as the same. So most people here fell in the category of thinking that things were pretty clear. There were, of course, mistakes along the way. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that there were a handful of new changes this year. Change is difficult for folks, and that can sometimes be difficult in disseminating, particularly on campuses that are kind of shifting their leadership, which did happen around this time period. And then part of the way through, campuses rated their historical completion success rates at 3.1 versus a current success rate of 3.7. I did find that campuses actually in general were pretty honest. You do see a very positive correlation between campus completion rate and campus self-rated success rate. So first of all, kudos to all of you for having honest reflections about that kind of information. So I'm inclined to take that also seriously when you all say, I think that we did better this year than we have in previous years. A couple of fast facts that I thought were really interesting along the way. Some of these are actually very surprising to me. One of them is that online campuses who regularly communicated, that meant on a weekly basis or more, had 18% higher completion rates than campuses that only communicated twice a month or less. And so there's a very clear feedback loop here, right? The more that we get on parents, the more that we're organizing with kids, the more likely it is that you got your kids in and tested. The second thing here, and this really, really surprised me, is that there is basically no correlation between campus size and completion rates. I really actually expected bigger schools to struggle a lot more with getting their tests completed. And the reality is that just isn't the case. The R equals 0.1 for those of you who are math geeks is more or less saying that this is just a cloud of data. How big you are, it doesn't impact your completion rates. So if that's something that you're looking at as a campus, you're very big, you're very small, and you're saying, oh, it should go this way or that way, don't be surprised if you're a small school and you end up struggling. It doesn't come for granted. You have to make a plan around this. And on the other hand, if you're a big school and you're saying, well, I just have too many kids, I would recommend reaching out to some of the schools that are succeeding, that are just as large as you are. The other thing that really surprised me in this category is that it didn't really have a pattern between administrator experience and what completion rates were. So that 64, 57, 75, 63, you see those numbers kind of bouncing up and down. And those correlate with different categories of experience that DHCs had. So that 64% completion rate was for DHCs with 6 months or fewer or less, 6 months or less experience in the role. And the lowest group was indeed the ones that's like the 6 months to 1 year, so on the newer side of DHCs. And the most completion rate was for DHCs that were between 1 and 2 years in their role. But then we drop back down to 63 for DHCs that have been here for 2 or more years. And so that kind of up and down pattern to me is saying that, look, it doesn't really matter how long you've been in the role. It's really about the decisions that you make in terms of how you're running things. We could create a narrative around this if we want to, but I actually think that gets more dangerous than just looking at these numbers here and noticing that sort of zigzag pattern there. So for a couple things I've already kind of commented on or reflected on, but let me dive into a few more and talk about what I see as kind of some of the wins here. I think that the structure while maintaining campus freedom is a perpetual fusion goal and challenge, right? You want to make sure that there's support for campuses. So many times you hear there's not enough supports, not enough structures, not enough examples. But then if you go too hard on that, campuses don't have the freedom to do what they want to do. So I actually think that this structure did allow for campuses to have that freedom while offering something as well. I don't know that it will look the same in the future. That's something definitely to consider. Another thing that was a win is a lot of people named over and over and over again having an assessment coordinator, having a point person for contact, someone to go to for help that was in the organization and kind of understood their circumstances was very, very helpful for them. That one quote that I pulled from that was, moving Nick into the role and making data the focus of AD ETEs has made a huge difference. So people are seeing that. And then further, that this is not just something that we're doing to make testing happen. This is a whole organizational push. The ed team is making changes. We're going out with rolling out Canvas in the coming year, so that you're going to see that data integration piece even into our learning management system. Here's the quote I pulled from that. It really felt like there was not just a campus-wide, but overall organizational push for map testing as well. Because as an AD, I was pretty focused on this type of data given our ETE theme of DIBM, which is data-informed decision-making. Regular updates and deadlines along the way, having, maybe that just ties in with the point person and contact, but a couple of people actually named that, being held accountable for what needed to be done, receiving regular updates, and having clear deadlines all contributed to the success that we had. And then, this is something that wasn't necessarily as visible for all of you, but the online testing itself was actually a very, very smooth process. I tested well over 500 kids, almost with no help. I ended up dismissing almost every single person that had signed up for sessions with me because I overestimated how difficult it was going to be. And so I ended up being able to dismiss folks. And testing went really smooth. I was testing groups of 80 kids at a time every once in a while. And of those 500 kids, I had less than 10 have technical difficulties that precluded them from testing, or kind of emotional breakdowns where they needed to stop. They really couldn't keep going. And so a few folks mentioned to me their concern about the impersonal nature of online testing. I actually think for a lot of our kids, they came, they had their cameras off, they got the directions, they logged into the test, got testing, and then just went about their business. Actually went really, really smoothly. And then again, I'm gonna toot this horn as much as possible. The sheer volume of kids that we tested this year, I think, was absolutely incredible. I do also want to look at a couple things that were not so great. Parents is the number one contest struggle that we're having. There's no question about it. This was something that was named before when I had an initial AD survey in November. So it's not something that we don't all know. Getting parents to agree to schedule a time and then not forgetting about that time is the hardest thing. The added component that was difficult was for those of you doing the online cohort testing. I didn't really anticipate this, but looks like basically every single email that I ever sent out went into promotional folders. And, that was something that partway through I'd identified and kind of mentioned to all of you and was really pushing for campuses to make sure that they're communicating out. But what an unfortunate circumstance. These emails going to promotional folders are not helpful for us. And parents are looking at them and saying they're not taking them seriously, even though the title of them says, action requested, fusion testing. It makes no difference whatsoever, which is really a shame. The other thing, of course, is also just parent confusion or contention. Just not enough of our families understand what map testing is, why we do it. I had multiple ADs who are oh my God, or BHCs who are oh my God, the number of people that I've had to explain this to and go through it time and time again. It's really a shame, right? It's something that I think we need to make a little bit more central to our conversation so they're not surprised when these things come up. Like I said kind of earlier, we want to get to a place where parents are asking, hey, when can I see my kid's scores, rather than, wait, what is this that we're talking about here? The other thing too is parents would just sign up for any time whenever they felt like it, even though